The harsh laughter cut through the morning air like shrapnel. Commander Eliza Monroe struggled with the heavy ordnance reports, her small frame straining against the weight of the classified binders. Old injuries sent familiar sparks of pain through nerve endings that had never quite healed. Her stars, once 3, now stripped to a single silver pin, caught the light as she shifted the load. "Hey there, sweetheart. Let the real officers handle this." Captain James Hartwell's voice boomed across the Pentagon hallway. His hands shoved her shoulder hard enough to make her stumble. 4 young officers in crisp uniforms circled her like predators sensing weakness. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." The smell of fresh starch and arrogance rolled off them in waves, mixing with the recycled air and coffee. Administrative personnel aren't authorized to touch high-level strategic documents. Hartwell jabbed his finger at the commander insignia on Eliza's collar, his face twisted with contempt. "Get away from my briefing materials now." Eliza rose slowly, her hands trembling, not from fear, but from something deeper that she had buried for 7 long years. She met Hartwell's gaze with eyes that held secrets he couldn't begin to fathom. Dark eyes that had seen things these fresh-faced officers only encountered in their worst nightmares. "I have orders to deliver these reports to the Joint Chiefs before 0800 hours, she said, her voice coming out rough like gravel grinding against steel. The morning sun through the high windows cast long shadows across the corridor, highlighting the careful way she moved, as if every step required conscious thought. Hartwell's laugh was cruel and sharp. He shoved her again, harder this time, the force jarring through her slight frame. "I don't give a damn about your orders, Princess. These documents belong to real strategists." They had no idea that every report she carried contained operations she had designed, operations that had saved thousands of lives. They couldn't know about the unbearable truth of why she alone survived to remember the consequences, or the classified decision that had transformed her from one of the military's elite strategic minds into a ghost hiding in plain sight. The other officers joined in, their juvenile behavior escalating as they fed off each other's energy. "What's wrong with your hands?" One of them sneered, noticing the slight tremor she couldn't completely hide. "Too much caffeine this morning?" Eliza bent to retrieve the spilled papers, her movements practiced and efficient, despite the pain that shot through her right shoulder. As her sleeve rolled up, a long, jagged scar became visible on her forearm, pale against her tan skin. The mark was distinctive. Not the clean line of surgery, but the chaotic pattern of shrapnel and fire. "Nice scar." The youngest officer's voice dripped with mockery. "What happened? Cut yourself on a stapler?" The group erupted in laughter, each trying to outdo the other with clever insults. Eliza said nothing, just continued sorting the documents with precision that seemed almost ritualistic. She counted each page, checked security clearance codes, arranged them in the binder with the kind of care usually reserved for handling explosives. It was the attention to detail of someone who understood that in war, one faulty intelligence assessment could mean the difference between life and death, someone who had learned that lesson in the hardest way possible. Hartwell watched her movements with growing irritation. There was something about the way she handled the classified materials that bothered him, though he couldn't quite place what it was. She moved with too much familiarity, too much confidence for a simple administrative commander. Then he saw it. As Eliza reached for another folder, her security badge slipped out from beneath her uniform for just a moment before she quickly tucked it back. He caught a glimpse of text etched into the plastic. The clearance level was barely visible, worn from years of use, but unmistakable to anyone who knew Pentagon security protocols. "What's this?" Hartwell's voice took on a predatory tone, sensing new ammunition for his cruelty. "You trying to play dress-up with someone else's security clearance?" He stepped closer, invading her personal space with the confidence of someone who'd never been truly challenged. The morning air grew thick with tension as Eliza's jaw tightened, but she continued her work with mechanical precision. Without thinking, she began arranging the documents in order of strategic importance, her eyes automatically tracking deployment statistics and checking for discrepancies. The movements were so natural, so unconscious, that they seemed like muscle memory from thousands of hours of strategic planning operations. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The realization hit Hartwell like a physical blow. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" His voice rose to a near shout, drawing attention from across the hallway. "You think you're some kind of strategist?" The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Eliza had pulled out a small notebook and was making notations, following what looked like a strategic assessment checklist from memory. It was too much for Hartwell's ego to bear, a commander demoted to administrative work, the lowest of the low in his mind, daring to act like she understood his strategic briefs. Hartwell snatched the checklist from her hands, tearing it into pieces with theatrical rage. The torn paper fluttered to the ground like dying moths, each piece carrying away another fragment of the life Eliza had once lived. "You want to pretend you're a strategist? You want to play warrior?" His face had turned red, veins standing out on his neck like battle lines drawn in flesh. The other officers formed a semicircle behind him, feeding off his anger, their mob mentality growing stronger with each passing second. What had started as morning routine was escalating into something darker, something that would expose secrets buried deeper than any of them could imagine. Eliza bent down to gather the torn pieces of paper, her back to them, shirt pulling tight across her shoulders. Through the fabric, just for a moment, the hint of black ink became visible, complex patterns that spoke of artistry and meaning far beyond anything these young officers could comprehend. And in that moment, as the Pentagon morning sun climbed higher and the shadows grew shorter, none of them realized they were standing at the precipice of a revelation that would change everything they thought they knew about heroism, sacrifice, and the true cost of war. The torn paper pieces scattered in the morning breeze from the air conditioning vent, carrying with them the last remnants of Eliza's carefully constructed anonymity. "Oh, look, she's got tattoos, too." The officer with lieutenant's bars laughed, pointing at the brief glimpse of ink through Eliza's uniform. "What is it, a butterfly?" "A heart with, Mom, written in it." How precious. The mockery came from all sides now, each officer trying to score points with Hartwell by being crueler than the last. Eliza stood slowly, the torn papers clutched in her hands, her knuckles white with the effort of maintaining control. For the first time, emotion flickered across her face. But it wasn't fear or shame. It was something older, deeper, a weariness that spoke of battles fought in places these young officers had only seen in briefing papers. Places where the enemy didn't announce themselves with formal declarations and radio chatter. "Don't touch my things," she said quietly, but there was steel in her voice that made the laughter falter for just a moment. Hartwell, however, was too far gone in his power trip to notice the warning. He grabbed the torn papers from her hands and threw them into the air with dramatic flair. "Or what? You'll report me? You'll run crying to your administrative sergeant?" He was performing now, playing to his audience of fellow officers who hung on his every word. The morning had turned into theater with Eliza cast as the victim and Hartwell as the conquering hero. Around them, other personnel had begun to notice the commotion, but none dared to intervene. Hartwell's reputation for vindictiveness was well known throughout the Pentagon. Eliza's hands shook as she reached into her medical kit, extracting military-grade pain medication that cost more than most people's monthly salary. The prescription neurological drugs were the only pharmaceuticals that kept her damaged nerves stable enough for the precise work she needed to perform daily. Years of chronic pain had taught her to manage the worst of it, but stress always made everything worse. She dry-swallowed 2 pills with practiced efficiency, emotion that spoke of countless mornings just like this one, fighting through pain that others couldn't see or understand. Hartwell's eyes lit up with malicious glee. "Pills too? What's wrong? Can't handle a little stress without your drugs?" He shoved her away from the documents with unnecessary force, his hands rough against her shoulders. "Get away from my briefing. You don't deserve to even look at it." The shove was harder than necessary, meant to humiliate as much as move her. Eliza stumbled backward, her boot catching on the uneven floor. As she fell, her briefcase spilled open, its contents scattering across the marble floor like pieces of a puzzle waiting to be solved. The items that tumbled out told a story the officers were too blind to read. A worn field manual for advanced strategic operations, its pages marked and annotated in margins with notes that spoke of real experience. An old challenge coin with a cracked surface, but obviously well-maintained, the kind of token that serious strategists kept as reminders of critical missions. And then there was the photograph, half-burned and carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve. It showed a group of people in formal dress uniforms standing in the Oval Office. Their faces were obscured by fire damage, but their posture spoke of elite training and unbreakable bonds. The president in the background wasn't the current one, but his predecessor's predecessor, marking this as a photo from nearly a decade ago. "Look at this." Hartwell picked up the damaged photo, waving it in the air like a trophy. "Wannabe strategist carries around pictures of real warriors. What is this, your fan collection?" He examined the photo more closely, his expression shifting from mockery to curiosity despite himself. The uniforms in the photo bore insignia, unlike anything in standard service, and something about the image seemed significant in a way he couldn't quite grasp. "That's supposed to be some special strategy unit?" Hartwell's question came out half mocking, half curious. The other officers gathered around to look, their juvenile behavior momentarily forgotten in the face of something that seemed genuinely mysterious. Eliza's response was barely audible, forced out through clenched teeth like a confession extracted under torture. "Operation Northern Light, October 2018. The words fell into the morning air like stones into still water, creating ripples of unease among the gathered officers. Across the hallway, an older man in a formal uniform suddenly went very still. General Richardson had been walking past, heading to his own office, but those words stopped him cold. He turned slowly, his weathered face showing the kind of recognition that comes from touching something classified and dangerous. Richardson had been in command long enough to know when someone spoke about things that weren't supposed to exist, operations that never appeared in official records. "What did you just say?" Richardson's voice cut through the group's chatter like a blade through silk. Hartwell, annoyed at the interruption of his entertainment, waved dismissively. "This administrative wannabe is pretending she knows about some operation. Probably saw it in a movie." But Richardson wasn't listening to Hartwell anymore. His attention was fixed entirely on Eliza, on the way she knelt on the floor, gathering her scattered possessions with the careful precision of someone handling sacred artifacts. He'd seen that look before in the eyes of operators who'd been places and done things that never made it into their official service records. Hartwell grabbed Eliza by the upper arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to leave bruises. "Let me explain something to you, Princess. Real strategists know their place. We don't pretend. We don't play dress-up with security clearances. And we sure as hell don't let administrative personnel touch our sensitive materials." The shove that followed was violent, intended to hurt and humiliate in equal measure. Hartwell pushed Eliza hard into the wall, the corner of a picture frame catching her uniform shirt and tearing it along the seam. The sound of tearing fabric cut through the morning air like a gunshot. Eliza twisted away from the wall, trying desperately to minimize the damage, but it was too late. The tear ran from her collar to mid-back, revealing what she'd spent 7 years hiding from the world. The tattoo was massive, covering most of her upper back in intricate black ink that seemed to move in the morning light. A phoenix rose from stylized flames, its wings spread wide in defiant resurrection, but it was the details within the design that made General Richardson take an involuntary step backward. 9 stars were woven into the phoenix's wings, each one carefully placed with mathematical precision. Each star bore a name too small to read from a distance, but clearly visible to anyone who looked closely enough. Across the bottom, in military script that looked like it had been carved rather than tattooed, were the words that changed everything. Operation Northern Light KIA 2018. Holy. One of the young officers, breath caught, the word dying in his throat as the significance began to dawn on him. This wasn't some wannabe's fantasy tattoo picked from a parlor wall. This was a memorial, a living gravestone etched in flesh and ink. The kind of tribute that only someone who'd been there, who'd survived when others hadn't, would carry on their body like a burden and an honor combined. The morning seemed to pause, even the distant sound of ringing phones fading as everyone stared at the revealed artwork. Eliza tried desperately to pull the torn fabric closed, to cover what should never have been seen, but the damage was done. The tattoo was too large. too significant to hide now that it had been exposed to the light. General Richardson stepped forward, his face pale beneath his silver hair. Years of classified operations had taught him to recognize the real thing when he saw it, and what he was looking at now made his blood run cold. That's a Strategic Command memorial tattoo. His voice carried the weight of someone who understood exactly what those words meant, who knew the price that kind of ink represented. Impossible, Hartwell sputtered, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. He was smart enough to know that Richardson didn't speak lightly about such things. The general had been in command for 25 years, had seen enough classified operations to recognize authentic military artistry when it stood before him. She's just a... But the words died as Richardson raised a hand for silence, his attention completely focused on the intricate memorial covering Eliza's back. "Do you have any idea what Operation Northern Light was, Captain?" Richardson's question was quiet but carried more authority than any shout could have managed. When Hartwell shook his head, Richardson continued, his eyes never leaving the tattoo that told a story of sacrifice and loss. August 12, 2018, a Strategic Command team made the wrong call during a crisis simulation. 9 people died in the aftermath when the simulation was applied to a real-world scenario. Quote. He paused, the weight of his next words visible on his weathered face. Officially, there were no survivors. The silence that followed was absolute. Every eye turned to Eliza, who stood with her back exposed to the morning light, tears running silently down her face. The torn uniform hung like broken wings, revealing not just the tattoo, but a network of burn scars that traced across her skin like a map of hell itself. These weren't the clean scars of surgery or the simple marks of accident. These were the chaotic patterns left by an explosion and collapsing infrastructure. The signature of someone who'd been inside a command center as it died around them, someone who'd stayed when any sane person would have fled. Hartwell's face had gone from red to white, his earlier bravado evaporating like morning mist in desert heat. That's not. She can't be. But even as he stammered his denial, more details became visible. The tattoo artist had been a master craftsman, working the memorial design around existing scars, incorporating them into the phoenix's form. It was a work of art born from tragedy, beauty carved from unbearable loss. Richardson, what the hell is going on here? A new voice cut through the frozen tableau. Secretary of Defense Victor Daniels strode down the hallway with the purposeful gait of someone who'd spent decades making decisions that changed the course of history. His eyes took in the scene in an instant, the torn uniform, the exposed tattoo, the circle of stunned officers, and Eliza Monroe standing at the center of it all, looking like she wanted the earth to swallow her whole. Richardson's voice was steady but urgent as he addressed his superior. "Sir, I think we found Echo 1. The words hit Daniels like a physical blow. His steady stride faltered, and for just a moment the iron control that had carried him through 30 years of public service cracked like glass under pressure. "That's impossible," he said. But he was already moving forward, drawn by the terrible possibility of Richardson's words. Eliza stood frozen as Secretary Daniels approached. Her attempts to cover the tattoo abandoned. There was no point now. Too many people had seen. Too many questions were already forming. The secret she'd guarded for 7 years, the identity she'd buried beneath the mundane life of an administrative commander was unraveling with each passing second, like a rope under too much tension. Daniels stopped directly behind her, close enough to read the names etched into the 9 stars. His sharp intake of breath was audible in the corridor's silence. Miller, Ramirez, Thornton, Chen. He read the names slowly, each one a weight on his tongue. These are the 4 who died in the field. His voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, but in the silent morning, everyone heard every word with crystal clarity. The 5 that Echo 1 couldn't save with her strategy. Eliza's shoulders shook with suppressed sobs, her body trembling with the effort of maintaining military bearing, while her carefully constructed world collapsed around her like a house of cards in a hurricane. "I tried," she whispered, the words torn from somewhere deep inside where she kept her darkest memories locked away. "I tried to develop a better approach, but the intelligence was flawed. The simulation parameters were wrong. I couldn't." Her voice broke entirely, 7 years of guilt and grief pouring out in those few anguished words. The Pentagon morning bore witness to pain that had been carried in silence, in shadows. in the careful anonymity of an administrative uniform that hid the truth of who she really was. Daniels placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, careful to avoid the scarred areas visible beneath the torn fabric. His touch was that of a leader who'd sent too many people into harm's way, who understood the weight that survivors carried. "Colonel Eliza Monroe," he said formally, using the rank she'd earned and lost. Echo 1. The best strategic mind the command ever produced. The gathered officers stood in stunned silence as the magnitude of what they were witnessing sank in like lead weights in their stomachs. This wasn't just any officer standing before them with her secrets exposed. This was a legend walking among them, a ghost story whispered in ready rooms and officers' clubs across the military intelligence community. The strategist who'd developed plans that saved thousands of lives until one terrible day when intelligence failures led to disaster. The woman who'd been caught in the explosion at Strategic Command, who'd tried to warn her superiors about flawed intelligence data, who'd made the impossible choice to sacrifice some to save many. Hartwell's legs seemed to give out beneath him. He dropped to one knee, not in respect but in shock so profound it affected his ability to remain standing. His entire worldview, built on the superiority of his strategic command position and his status as an elite officer, had just been shattered like glass against concrete. The woman he'd been shoving around, mocking, treating as less than human, was a hero whose actions made his own service look like a child's game of soldier. The cognitive dissonance was almost too much for his mind to process. We didn't know," he stammered, but the words were meaningless in the face of what had been revealed. "Of course you didn't know, Secretary Daniels." Voice turned hard as steel, cutting through the morning air with the precision of a blade. "Because Colonel Monroe chose to disappear. She accepted a demotion to commander. She gave up her stars and vanished into the administrative corps to protect classified information about Operation Northern Light. She sacrificed everything she'd worked for." He looked around at the gathered officers, his expression showing exactly what he thought of their earlier behavior. Years of experience in the halls of power had taught him to read situations quickly, and what he saw disgusted him. She sacrificed everything. She surrendered everything she'd worked for. And you? His gaze settled on Hartwell with laser intensity. You treated her like garbage because she carries your documents. The weight of Daniels' words settled over the group like a burial shroud. In the distance, the sound of approaching security grew louder, but no one moved. They stood frozen in a tableau of revelation and shame, watching as Eliza Monroe, the woman they'd dismissed as nothing, was revealed as everything they aspired to be. The morning sun climbed higher through the tall windows, casting harsh light on the phoenix tattoo, making it seem to move with each breath. Eliza took 9 stars for 9 lives, 5 lost, 4 saved, and 1 survivor who had chosen to live with the weight rather than accept the medal she'd earned in blood and fire. A small crowd had begun to gather as word spread across the Pentagon with the speed that only military gossip could achieve. Junior officers appeared in doorways, though none dared to record openly. What they were witnessing felt too sacred, too raw for casual documentation. An older veteran pushed through the growing crowd, his weathered face streaked with tears that carved channels through decades of hardship and a lifetime of service. His approach was hesitant, respectful, as if he were approaching a shrine rather than a person. "You saved my daughter," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion that 7 years hadn't diminished. "Amanda Chen was my daughter. She wrote me before she died in the hospital. Said an angel at Strategic Command tried to stop the operation. Said the simulation was wrong, that you fought to change the parameters." He reached out with shaking hands, not quite touching Eliza's scarred back, but hovering close enough to feel the heat of her pain. "She lived long enough to tell me the truth because of you, long enough to explain that she wasn't scared at the end because she knew someone had cared enough to try." More voices joined his as word spread and understanding dawned. Other family members, fellow veterans who'd heard fragments of the story, people who had been touched by the 4 lives she'd saved by convincing them not to deploy, began to form a protective circle around her. Each testimony was another crack in the wall she'd built around herself, another reminder that heroes were measured not by those they couldn't save, but by those they could. Daniel's next words cut through the gathering crowd with surgical precision. "Captain Hartwell, you just assaulted a Presidential Intelligence Medal recipient." The blood drained from Hartwell's face so quickly that for a moment it seemed he might faint right there on the Pentagon floor. The sound of approaching vehicles cut through the morning air. A convoy of black SUVs had arrived at the Pentagon entrance, their arrival urgent and official. The lead vehicle's door opened before it had fully stopped, and the Secretary of State emerged with the kind of purposeful stride that meant someone's career was about to end in spectacular fashion. Her eyes swept the scene with political efficiency, taking in the recording phones, the crying woman with the phoenix tattoo, and the captain still on his knees on the floor. Years of diplomatic experience had taught her to read situations quickly, and what she saw here made her jaw clench with barely controlled fury. "Mr. Secretary." Her voice could have cut steel. "Report." Daniel's briefing was concise and devastating. In less than 2 minutes, he laid out 7 years of injustice, cover-ups, and a hero forced to live in shadows to protect state secrets that had cost her everything she'd worked for. Each word was chosen with precision, building a case that would have consequences reaching far beyond this Pentagon morning. The Secretary of State's face grew darker with each detail. When Daniels finished, she turned to study Eliza, still standing with her back exposed, the monument to the fallen, written in ink and scar tissue across her skin like a living memorial that she carried everywhere she went. "Colonel Monroe." The Secretary's voice gentled, taking on the tone reserved for addressing someone who'd sacrificed more than should be asked of any human being. "Stand up, soldier." It took Eliza 3 attempts to get to her feet. Her legs shook. Whether from the old wounds or the emotional trauma was impossible to tell. She stood at attention out of pure muscle memory even as tears continued to stream down her face, cutting tracks through makeup and the remnants of a life spent hiding from her own heroism. The Secretary moved closer, close enough to see every detail of the memorial tattoo, every carefully placed star, every line of script that told the story of a night that had changed everything for everyone involved. "I remember the hearings," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion that years of politics had taught her to control. "I was an undersecretary then, sat on the review board. We knew something was wrong with your testimony. Nobody volunteers for a demotion. Nobody gives up their stars without a fight unless there's something bigger at stake." She paused, her own voice betraying the weight of institutional failure. "But orders came from so high up we couldn't see the top. Bury it, they said. National security, they said. Protect the intelligence assets still in play." Her fist clenched at her side as the full scope of what had been done became clear. "We failed you, Colonel. The system failed you, and today that ends." The Secretary turned to face the crowd that had grown to include what seemed like half the Pentagon staff. Her voice carried the authority of someone who'd decided to right a wrong, regardless of the consequences that might flow upward through channels she couldn't control. "Effective immediately, I'm ordering a full review of the Operation Northern Light files. Colonel Monroe will be reinstated to full rank pending medical clearance. All records of disciplinary action will be expunged from her service record." She looked directly at Hartwell, who seemed to shrink under her gaze like a man facing Judgment Day. "And Captain Hartwell's team will be reassigned to sensitivity training before they're allowed near another classified document. Their security clearances are suspended pending a full investigation into their conduct." Eliza's voice cracked as she tried to protest, the words coming out broken and desperate. "Madam Secretary, I can't. I don't deserve." But the Secretary cut her off with a raised hand, her expression brooking no argument. 9 families have spent 7 years believing their loved ones died because of flawed strategy or equipment failure. 4 of those families know better because their children lived to tell them the truth about what really happened that day. Her voice carried across the assembled crowd with the weight of absolute authority. It's time the other 5 families knew their people died as heroes, not victims of incompetence or bad intelligence. They deserve to know that someone cared enough to risk everything trying to stop the operation based on flawed intelligence. They deserve to know the truth. The crowd parted as more people arrived, drawn by words spreading through the Pentagon communication networks. Some were in uniform, others in civilian clothes, but they all had the same look in their eyes: recognition, respect, and something approaching awe. A general with a strategic command patch on his shoulder stepped forward, his bearing marking him as someone who'd served in the special intelligence community. "I worked with Miller and Thornton on their previous assessment," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of personal loss. "They'd have been proud to have their names on your back, Colonel. Proud to be remembered by the strategist who gave everything trying to save them." Someone from the crowd brought forward a formal uniform jacket, holding it out to Eliza like an offering at an altar. It was her old one, somehow retrieved from whatever storage facility had held the remnants of her former life. The silver eagles still attached to the epaulets, though tarnished by time and the weight of bureaucratic injustice. She stared at it like it might burn her hands, this symbol of everything she'd lost and everything she'd been. The fabric represented not just a uniform, but an identity she'd been forced to abandon, dreams that had been sacrificed on the altar of classified operations and political expedience. "Put it on," Daniel said gently, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd seen too many good people broken by a system that should have protected them. "You've been hiding long enough." With shaking hands, Eliza took the uniform jacket. The crowd turned their backs, giving her privacy as she changed out of the torn commander's uniform that had been her camouflage for 7 long years. When she emerged, it was like watching a phoenix rise from its own ashes, transformed by fire into something both beautiful and terrible. The colonel's eagles gleamed on her shoulders, polished by someone who understood their significance. The uniform still fit, though it hung differently on her scarred frame. But she stood straighter, carried herself with the bearing of the elite strategist she'd always been beneath the uniform that had hidden her true nature. For the first time in 7 years, Eliza Monroe looked like who she really was instead of whose circumstances had forced her to become. As the morning sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the Pentagon corridors, Eliza found herself standing before the same classified documents where this revelation had begun. But now she approached not as an administrative commander delivering papers, but as a strategist remembering what it felt like to have authority instead of punishment. Her hand traced the cover page with the tenderness of a lover's touch, fingers finding familiar classifications and code names that spoke to muscle memory buried but never forgotten. The papers were warm under the overhead lights, alive with the potential for decisions that could save lives instead of sacrificing them needlessly. "I don't know if I can do it again," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible above the hum of the air conditioning. "Last time I made strategic assessments, 5 people didn't come home. Last time I trusted my skills, good people died because I wasn't persuasive enough, forceful enough, better enough to make them listen to my concerns." The Secretary of State stood beside her, her presence solid and reassuring like an anchor in a storm that had been raging for 7 years. "5 people didn't come home," she said quietly, her words carrying the weight of absolute truth. "But 4 families got to say goodbye because of you. That's what you need to remember, Colonel. That's what matters." She pulled out a security badge, the universal symbol of Pentagon authority. Plastic and technology combined in a small package that represented everything Eliza had thought she'd lost forever. "The Joint Chiefs are meeting in an hour to discuss the Taiwan situation. Interested in joining us as an advisor?" Eliza stared at the badge like it was made of plutonium, dangerous and powerful beyond measure. Taking it again meant facing the demon she'd buried beneath layers of administrative paperwork and mundane routine. It meant accepting that she was a strategist, not a failure hiding in the clerical pool. The weight of decision pressed down on her like the summer heat, heavy and inescapable. Around them, the crowd had grown larger as word spread through official and unofficial channels. But their presence faded into background noise as Eliza wrestled with a choice that would define the rest of her life. Hartwell approached one final time, moving carefully like someone approaching a wounded animal that might lash out at any moment. His entire team stood behind him, their earlier cockiness replaced by something approaching genuine humility born from the ashes of their ignorance. "Colonel Monroe," he began formally, the words coming out stiff with unaccustomed respect. I was wrong. Wrong about everything. Wrong about who you are. Wrong about what you've done. Wrong about what you deserve." He reached up to his collar, unpinning his own captain's bars with hands that shook slightly. The gesture was theatrical but seemed genuine as he held them out to her. "I don't deserve to wear these after what I did today, after how I treated a real strategist who's accomplished more than I ever will." Eliza looked at the offered insignia, then at the young officer holding them. His face was streaked with tears that carved channels through arrogance and shame. The cocky attitude of the morning replaced by something that looked like genuine remorse. "Keep them," she said finally, her voice stronger than it had been all morning. "But remember that they're not what makes you valuable to this country. It's what you do when everything goes wrong. When people are depending on you, when the easy choice is to save yourself, that's what defines you." She turned away from him, but then paused, looking back over her shoulder. "And Captain, next time you see someone you think is beneath you, remember that heroes don't always advertise. Sometimes the most important people are the ones you'd never suspect." The security badge felt impossibly heavy in her palm as she closed her fingers around it. 7 years of running from who she'd been. 7 years of hiding from the weight of survival and the burden of being the one who lived when others died. But maybe it was time to stop running. Maybe it was time to remember how to lead. The Joint Chiefs conference room waited, patient as only institutions can be, ready to welcome her back to the strategy table where she belonged. Around her, the Pentagon morning continued its ancient rhythm, but everything had changed in the space of a few hours. The woman who had delivered documents as the sun rose would walk into the Strategic Command meeting as a different person entirely. Not because she had changed, but because the world had finally seen who she'd always been. Colonel Eliza Monroe, call sign Echo 1, walked toward the secure elevator with the fluid grace of someone born to lead. Her security protocols were thorough, professional, the movements of a strategist whose skills had been honed by years of training and tested by fire. The crowd watched in respectful silence as she prepared to reclaim the authority that had once been her domain. The secure elevator hummed as it descended to the subterranean levels of the Pentagon, where the nation's most sensitive strategic discussions took place. Eliza stood motionless, watching the floor numbers tick down on the digital display. Each decreasing number marked her journey back to a world she'd been exiled from for 7 years. A world of high-stakes decisions and the crushing responsibility that came with them. Her mind raced with conflicting emotions. The vindication of having her true identity restored warred with the terror of returning to the role that had cost 9 lives. The security badge in her hand felt like both a key to freedom and a chain binding her to painful memories. When the doors slid open, the familiar layout of the Strategic Command Center spread before her. Banks of monitors displayed global situations in real time, satellite imagery, troop movements, intelligence briefs, all flowing together into a constant stream of information that required the sharpest minds to interpret. 7 years ago, this had been her domain, the place where her analytical abilities had saved countless lives until that one terrible day. A hush fell over the room as she stepped out of the elevator. Younger analysts glanced up from their stations, confused by the sudden silence. The veterans, though those who had been here 7 years ago, recognized her immediately. Their expressions ranged from shock to disbelief to something approaching reverence. Colonel Monroe, Deputy Director Henderson stood from his station, his voice carrying across the command center. "I thought I'd never see you walk through those doors again." Henderson had been a junior analyst when Eliza was in command. Now he wore the insignia of a senior officer, his face bearing the lines of responsibility that came with years of making life-or-death decisions. "Neither did I, Deputy Director," Eliza replied, her voice steadier than she felt. The room seemed both familiar and alien. The technology had advanced, but the atmosphere of controlled tension remained the same. Secretary Daniels guided her through the command center toward the main conference room where the Joint Chiefs awaited. As they walked, Eliza's trained eyes automatically scanned the displays, absorbing information, making connections, identifying patterns. Even after 7 years, her mind slipped back into strategic analysis mode with an ease that was both comforting and terrifying. "You haven't lost it," Daniels observed quietly. "I can see you cataloging everything." Eliza nodded, unable to deny it. "It's like muscle memory. I don't think I could turn it off if I tried." They paused at the entrance to the conference room. Through the glass walls, Eliza could see the assembled Joint Chiefs, the highest-ranking military leaders in the nation, gathered around the polished table. Some faces she recognized, others were new. All looked grave as they studied the materials before them. "They're discussing a deteriorating situation in the Taiwan Strait," Daniels explained. "Chinese naval activity has increased dramatically in the past 48 hours. Intelligence suggests they may be preparing for a blockade, possibly as a prelude to more aggressive action." Eliza's heart rate accelerated. This wasn't a theoretical exercise or a training scenario. This was a real-world crisis with potential for catastrophic escalation. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, doubt flooding her voice. I haven't been in strategic planning for 7 years. The world has changed. Technology has changed. I could make things worse. Daniels met her gaze directly. No one understands the human element of strategic calculation better than you do, Colonel. You saw the flaws in the Northern Lights simulation when everyone else was blinded by the technology. We need that perspective now more than ever. Before she could respond, the conference room door opened and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs emerged. General Lance Marshall, a legendary figure whose career spanned 4 decades of military service, studied her with keen eyes that had witnessed the fall of the Soviet Union and the rise of modern China as a global superpower. "Colonel Monroe," he said, his deep voice resonating with authority. "Or should I say Echo One? Your reputation precedes you." Eliza snapped to attention instinctively. "Sir." Marshall's weathered face broke into an unexpected smile. "At ease, Colonel. I've spent the last hour being briefed on your situation. Seems we've had a tremendous strategic asset sitting in administrative purgatory for 7 years, while we've been facing increasingly complex global challenges." His directness caught Eliza off guard. She had expected skepticism, not immediate acceptance. "Sir, I'm not sure I still have what it takes," she admitted, honesty overriding protocol. "The Northern Light failure was a systemic intelligence breakdown that you tried to prevent," Marshall interrupted. "I've reviewed the declassified files. Your strategic assessment was correct. The implementation was flawed because critical intelligence was withheld from your team." He gestured toward the conference room. "We're facing a situation that could escalate to armed conflict if mishandled. I'd like your perspective. Not as a returned hero, not as a symbol of institutional failure, but as the strategic mind that saw patterns others missed." Eliza hesitated only briefly before following him into the room. The Joint Chiefs fell silent as she entered, all eyes turning to assess this unexpected addition to their meeting. Some faces showed recognition, others confusion, but all showed respect for the chairman's decision to include her. As she took her seat, Marshall addressed the room. "For those who don't know, this is Colonel Eliza Monroe, previously Echo One of Strategic Command. She'll be observing and advising on our Taiwan discussion." A Marine Corps general at the far end of the table leaned forward. "Echo One. The strategist from Operation Northern Light?" The question hung in the air, loaded with 7 years of rumors and classified whispers. Marshall nodded. "The same. And before we continue, I want to make something clear. Colonel Monroe's analyses were correct. The failures of Northern Light were institutional, not personal. She is here because we need her unique perspective, especially on a situation as volatile as Taiwan." The simple statement, delivered with Marshall's unquestionable authority, settled over the room like a blanket of clarity. No further explanation was needed, no justification required. In the military hierarchy, the chairman's word was sufficient. "Now," Marshall continued, turning to the digital display at the head of the table, "let's continue our assessment of Chinese naval deployments in the Taiwan Strait." The briefing resumed with intelligence officers detailing satellite imagery of Chinese vessels, aircraft movements, and communications intercepts. Eliza listened intently, her mind processing the information through frameworks developed over decades of strategic analysis. As the briefing progressed, she began to notice discrepancies, not in the intelligence itself, but in how it was being interpreted. The analysts were focusing on military capabilities and movements, but missing crucial cultural and historical contexts that would influence Chinese decision-making. 20 minutes into the presentation, Eliza found herself speaking before she'd consciously decided to do so. "You're misreading their intent," she said, her voice cutting through the briefing officer's explanation of deployment patterns. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to her. Doubt flickered through her mind. Who was she to challenge these analyses after 7 years away? But the patterns were clear to her, as obvious as constellations in a night sky. "Explain," Marshall said simply, giving her the floor. Eliza stood and moved to the display. "You're analyzing these deployments as a prelude to invasion or blockade, but the pattern doesn't fit either scenario. Look at the positioning of their missile frigates here and here." She pointed to 2 locations on the digital map. "They're arranged for maximum visibility, not maximum tactical advantage. And the timing, 3 days before their National Day celebrations, is significant. This is posturing, not preparation. They're sending a message to their domestic audience as much as to us. She turned to face the assembled leaders. If we respond as though this is an imminent attack, we'll create the very crisis we're trying to avoid. They'll be forced to escalate to save face, and we'll be on a path to confrontation neither side truly wants. A silence followed her analysis. Eliza felt her confidence wavering under the collective gaze of the nation's military leadership. Had she overstepped? Was she seeing patterns that weren't there, her judgment clouded by the need to prove herself? Then the Air Force Chief of Staff nodded slowly. She's right. The deployment pattern doesn't optimize for actual combat operations. It's too theatrical. And the timing with their National Day celebrations can't be coincidental, added the Navy's representative. A show of strength before a domestic audience makes sense. Marshall studied the display, his experienced eyes reassessing the information with Eliza's framework in mind. If Colonel Monroe is right, our planned response would be dangerously escalatory. We'd be treating a political statement as a military threat. He turned to Eliza. What would you recommend instead? The question hit her like a physical weight. 7 years ago, a similar question had led to Operation Northern Light and 9 stars on her back. The room seemed to recede slightly as memories threatened to overwhelm her. The pain medication she'd taken earlier was wearing off, sending familiar jolts of discomfort through her scarred nerves. But something was different this time. She wasn't alone in her assessment. Others saw the same pattern she did. And most importantly, she was being asked for her recommendation, not ordered to implement a flawed plan against her better judgment. A graduated response, she said, forcing steadiness into her voice. Maintain routine patrols but don't increase them. Make a public statement acknowledging their right to conduct exercises while reaffirming our commitment to regional stability. Most importantly, open a direct communication channel at the military level to prevent misunderstandings. She traced a line on the map. And position our submarines here, not to threaten, but to observe. If I'm wrong, if this is preparation for something more aggressive, they'll reveal their true intentions with their next movements. We'll have warning without having cornered them into escalation. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Marshall nodded decisively. That's our approach. Colonel Monroe's assessment aligns with what my instincts were telling me. But she's articulated the pattern clearly. He looked around the table. Any objections? There were none. In the space of 10 minutes, Eliza had shifted from an observer to a central voice in one of the most sensitive strategic discussions in the nation. As the meeting continued, Eliza found herself fully engaged, her mind working at a pace she hadn't experienced in 7 years. The administrative fog that had clouded her thinking had lifted, replaced by the crystal clarity that came with utilizing her true talents. When the meeting concluded 2 hours later, the Joint Chiefs filed out with new orders and a clearer understanding of the situation. Marshall lingered, studying Eliza with thoughtful eyes. "That was impressive work, Colonel," he said when they were alone, "especially for someone who's been away from strategic planning for 7 years. Eliza exhaled slowly, feeling drained but strangely fulfilled. "Thank you, sir." It felt right. Like coming home after a long absence. Marshall nodded. "Because it is where you belong. Strategic minds like yours don't come along often, Colonel. The country needs you back in this role permanently." The offer hung in the air between them. Not yet formal, but clear in its intent. "I'm not the same person I was 7 years ago," Eliza said carefully. "The scars aren't just physical. I see the consequences of decisions more clearly now. I'm more cautious." "Good," Marshall replied immediately. "Caution born from experience is wisdom, not weakness. The Colonel Monroe who just changed our entire Taiwan strategy is exactly the strategist we need. Not despite what happened with Northern Light, but because of it." He gestured to the now empty conference room. "You've just helped us avoid a potential armed confrontation with a nuclear power. That's what your perspective brings to the table." Eliza felt the weight of his words. For 7 years, she'd carried the burden of Northern Light as punishment, a reminder of failure and loss. The possibility that those same experiences could now be valuable, that her scars could be wisdom rather than shame, was almost too much to process. "I need time to think," she said finally. "This morning I was delivering documents. Now I'm advising on Taiwan. It's a lot to absorb." Marshall nodded. "Take the rest of the day. But know this. Tomorrow morning I'll be officially requesting your permanent reassignment to Strategic Command, with full restoration of rank and clearance. The country needs you, Colonel Monroe. And I think you need this too." As Eliza rode the elevator back to the main level, her mind replayed the meeting, analyzing her own performance with the same rigor she applied to strategic assessments. She had been decisive, clear, confident in her analysis despite 7 years away from the role. The elevator doors opened to reveal a changed Pentagon. Word of her reinstatement had spread throughout the building with the efficiency of a military operation. Junior officers stepped aside respectfully as she passed. Senior officials nodded in recognition. The isolation that had defined her existence for 7 years had evaporated in the space of a morning. As she approached the main atrium, a small group awaited her, the family members of those who had died in Operation Northern Light. Their presence stopped her in her tracks. These were the people she had failed, the ones whose loved ones had never come home because of flawed intelligence and impossible choices. An older woman stepped forward, her silver hair framing a face lined with grief but free from anger. "Colonel Monroe," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "I, Margaret Thornton. My son David was one of the 5. Eliza felt her chest tighten. "Mrs. Thornton, I—" The woman raised a hand, stopping Eliza's words. "For 7 years, I believed my son died because of strategic errors. Because someone didn't do their job correctly." Her eyes held Eliza's with surprising strength. "Today I learned that you tried to save him. That you fought against the operation because you knew the intelligence was wrong." She reached out and took Eliza's hand in both of hers. "I can't have my son back, but I can have the truth of how he died. And I can know that someone cared enough to try to prevent it, even at the cost of her own career." One by one, the other family members approached, parents, siblings, spouses of those who had died, carrying out the flawed operation. Each had a similar message. Not forgiveness, for there was nothing to forgive, but gratitude for the truth after years of official misdirection. The last to approach was a young woman in her 20s, her resemblance to one of the fallen officers unmistakable. "Colonel," she said, her voice catching slightly, "my father was Captain Miller. I was 15 when he died." She held out a small object, a tarnished silver star, the kind awarded for valor in the field. "This was his. He received it for an operation in Kosovo that you commanded. He always said you were the finest officer he'd ever served under. I think he'd want you to have it." Eliza stared at the offered medal, unable to speak. The star in the young woman's palm mirrored the stars tattooed across her back, symbols of sacrifice and memory, of duty and loss. With trembling fingers she accepted the star, closing her hand around it as if it contained some essence of the man who had once worn it with pride. "Thank you," she managed finally. "I'll carry it with honor." As the families departed, Eliza stood in the Pentagon atrium, the silver star warm in her palm, the security badge heavy in her pocket. 7 years of exile had ended, not with further punishment, but with understanding. Not with blame, but with a chance to use her hard-won wisdom to prevent future tragedies. The path ahead would not be easy. The scars, both physical and emotional, would always remain. The 9 stars on her back would continue to serve as a daily reminder of lives lost and the terrible cost of strategic decisions. But for the first time in 7 years, Eliza Monroe could see a future where those scars were not just symbols of failure, but foundations for building something better. The star in her hand caught the afternoon light streaming through the Pentagon's high windows. Not a burden, but a beacon. Not a symbol of what she had lost, but of what she might yet accomplish. The morning after her reinstatement, Eliza stood at the entrance to the Strategic Command offices, silver eagle insignia gleaming on her freshly issued uniform. The security guard, a young sergeant who hadn't been at the Pentagon during her previous tenure, checked her credentials with professional efficiency before nodding her through. "Welcome back, Colonel Monroe," he said, his tone conveying more than mere protocol. Word had spread throughout the building. The legend had returned. As she walked through the secure doors, Eliza felt the familiar weight of responsibility, settling across her shoulders. Today wasn't about vindication or personal redemption. It was about the work itself, the critical analyses and strategic decisions that shaped national security in ways few would ever fully understand. The command center hummed with controlled activity. Analysts monitored global situations across multiple screens. Communications specialists maintained secure channels with military assets worldwide, and intelligence officers sifted through terabytes of data for patterns that might indicate emerging threats. This organized chaos had once been as natural to her as breathing. Deputy Director Henderson approached, offering a steaming cup of coffee. Black with 1 sugar, if your preferences haven't changed. The simple gesture, remembering how she took her coffee after 7 years, touched her more deeply than any formal welcome could have. They haven't, she confirmed, accepting the cup. Thank you. The Taiwan situation developed along exactly the lines you predicted, Henderson said, guiding her toward her new office. The Chinese naval exercises concluded this morning without incident. General Marshall is calling it a textbook de-escalation. Eliza nodded, sipping the coffee. Good. Though we should monitor their submarine movements for the next 72 hours. They often test boundaries after public displays of restraint. Henderson smiled. Already on it. Some things never change. Your ability to think 3 moves ahead being one of them. Her new office, or rather, her old office reclaimed, felt both familiar and strange. The layout was the same, but the technology had been upgraded. A secure terminal dominated the desk, with multiple screens arranged for optimal information processing. A small American flag stood in one corner, next to an empty space clearly intended for personal items she didn't yet possess. We kept the layout the same, Henderson explained, noting her survey of the room. Thought it might help with the transition. It does, Eliza admitted, running her hand along the desk's edge. Though I'm not sure I deserve all this after 7 years of being punished for doing the right thing? Henderson interrupted, his tone firmer than before. With all due respect, Colonel, that narrative ends today. You were right about Northern Light. You're being restored to your position because the country needs your strategic mind, not as some kind of consolation prize. The directness of his statement caught her off guard. In the administrative wilderness of the past 7 years, she'd grown accustomed to deference tinged with pity. Henderson's matter-of-fact assessment was refreshingly honest. Fair enough, she conceded. So what's first on the agenda? Strategic assessment of the Middle East situation. Iran's proxies in 3 countries are showing increased activity. Intelligence can't determine if it's coordinated or coincidental. Meeting in 30 minutes with the regional experts. After Henderson departed, Eliza took a moment to center herself. The silver star given to her by Captain Miller's daughter rested in her palm, a tangible connection to one of the lives lost under her command. She placed it carefully on the desk, positioning it where it would be visible during her work hours. I'll do better this time, she whispered to the memory it represented. Not a promise of perfection, but a commitment to carry the lessons of the past into each new challenge. The Middle East briefing proved to be exactly the test she needed. As intelligence officers presented data on proxy activities across the region, Eliza found herself slipping back into the analytical mindset that had once defined her career. She identified connection patterns that others had missed, questioned assumptions about motivations, and proposed a framework for distinguishing between coordinated action and opportunistic coincidence. By the meeting's end, what had appeared to be a looming regional crisis had been recontextualized as separate situations requiring tailored responses rather than a unified strategic escalation. The relief among the senior officers was palpable. No one wanted another Middle East deployment if it could be avoided through smarter analysis. Impressive work, Colonel, General Marshall commented as the meeting concluded. You've just saved us from potentially committing significant resources to a phantom threat. Eliza nodded, accepting the compliment professionally. The data was all there. It just needed to be viewed through a different framework. As the weeks passed, Eliza settled into a rhythm that balanced her strategic duties with the physical therapy needed to manage her old injuries. The persistent pain that had dominated her existence for 7 years began to recede, not because it was actually diminishing, but because it was being countered by the satisfaction of meaningful work. Word of her analytical successes spread throughout the intelligence community. What had begun as a restoration of personal dignity was evolving into something more significant, a demonstration of how experience, even painful experience, could enhance strategic thinking rather than compromise it. 1 month into her return, Eliza faced her first true crisis. North Korean missile tests had escalated, from routine provocations to genuinely concerning demonstrations of new capabilities. Intelligence indicated a potential atmospheric nuclear test was being prepared, the first such test by any nation since 1980. The Strategic Command Center operated at maximum capacity as the situation developed. Eliza led the analysis team, correlating technical data with diplomatic signals and historical patterns of North Korean behavior. They're positioning this as a response to our joint exercises with South Korea, an intelligence officer reported, highlighting diplomatic communications intercepted from Pyongyang. But the timeline doesn't match, Eliza observed, studying the preparation sequence. They began assembling these components before our exercises were even announced. This was planned independently. For 48 hours, she worked almost continuously, catching short naps on the couch in her office when exhaustion threatened her analytical clarity. The pressure brought flashbacks to Operation Northern Light, the same high stakes, the same potential for catastrophic consequences if the wrong decision was made. But unlike Northern Light, this time she had the full support of command leadership. Her assessments weren't being filtered through political considerations or dismissed because they contradicted preferred narratives. When she identified a pattern suggesting the North Korean leadership was actually seeking a diplomatic opening rather than true escalation, General Marshall listened. "You're suggesting their nuclear posturing is designed to create leverage for negotiations, not preparation for actual conflict?" he asked, studying the evidence she'd assembled. "Exactly," Eliza confirmed. "The missile they're showcasing has significant technical flaws they must know we've detected. They're deliberately revealing capabilities that appear threatening but actually demonstrate limitations. It's an invitation to dialogue from a position that saves face domestically." The approach she recommended, firm but measured response coupled with private diplomatic channels offering a path to de-escalation, was implemented immediately. Within 72 hours, North Korean rhetoric had softened, and back-channel communications confirmed her assessment had been correct. As the crisis subsided, Eliza found herself in the Pentagon briefing room, explaining the strategic rationale to the Secretary of Defense and his senior staff. The scars on her back seemed to prickle as she stood before the same officials who, 7 years earlier, had allowed her to be scapegoated for Operation Northern Light. Colonel Monroe's analysis proved decisive. General Marshall explained to the assembled leadership. Her framework for distinguishing between genuine threats and negotiating postures prevented what could have been a dangerous escalation cycle. The secretary studied her with thoughtful eyes before responding. "Impressive work, Colonel. Though I understand this approach contradicted the consensus view among our regional experts." "It did," Eliza acknowledged, meeting his gaze directly. "But consensus can sometimes reflect shared blind spots rather than collective wisdom. Operation Northern Light taught me to question assumptions, especially when they align too neatly with institutional preferences." The room fell silent at her direct reference to the classified failure that had cost her career. She had broken an unwritten rule of Pentagon culture: never remind leadership of past institutional failures. The secretary's response surprised everyone. "Northern Light should have taught us all that lesson, Colonel. Perhaps if we'd listened to you then, 9 families wouldn't be mourning their loved ones today." His public acknowledgement of the Pentagon's failure, not just her personal vindication but institutional accountability, sent shockwaves through the room. Senior officials shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unaccustomed to such direct acceptance of systemic errors. "Which is why," the secretary continued, "I'm establishing a new strategic reassessment office under Colonel Monroe's leadership. This unit will have the authority to challenge consensus views and provide independent analysis directly to this office, without filtering through traditional channels." Eliza struggled to maintain her professional composure as the implications became clear. The secretary wasn't just restoring her position, he was creating an institutional framework to ensure that the failure of Operation Northern Light would never be repeated. Other voices like hers would have a protected channel to challenge flawed assumptions before they became deadly decisions. 3 months after her restoration to rank, Eliza stood before a different audience altogether, the graduating class of the National Defense University. These officers represented the future of military leadership, men and women who would carry strategic responsibilities for decades to come. "Strategic thinking isn't about predicting the future," she told them, her voice carrying clearly across the auditorium. It's about understanding patterns deeply enough to recognize when they're changing. It's about having the courage to challenge consensus when your analysis points in a different direction. She paused, conscious of the symbolic weight of her presence on this stage. The students knew her story. It had become a case study in their ethics and leadership courses. 7 years ago, I made a critical strategic assessment that contradicted what my superiors wanted to hear. I was right, but 9 people died because institutional pressures overrode analytical integrity. I spent 7 years carrying those 9 stars on my back, literally tattooed into my skin, as a reminder of the human cost of strategic failures. The auditorium was completely silent, hundreds of future leaders absorbing her words with the intensity of those who recognized their own potential futures in her story. I could stand here and tell you that moral courage always prevails, that speaking truth to power always works out in the end, but that would be a disservice to you and to the people whose lives will depend on your decisions. She touched the silver star pin now permanently affixed to her uniform collar, Captain Miller's star, a tangible connection to one of the fallen. The truth is harder than that. Sometimes you'll be right and still fail. Sometimes you'll face punishment rather than recognition. Sometimes the system will protect itself at your expense. But even then, your integrity matters. Your analytical rigor matters. The truth matters, even when it's inconvenient, even when it contradicts what people in power want to believe. In the front row, she recognized the face of Captain Hartwell, the officer whose bullying had inadvertently led to her restoration. He had requested assignment to her strategic reassessment office after completing his sensitivity training, a request she had granted despite initial misgivings. His expression now reflected not the arrogance of their first encounter, but the humility of someone who had learned painful but necessary lessons. Leadership isn't about rank or position, she continued. It's about the courage to stand by your analysis when it would be easier to go along with the crowd. It's about remembering that every strategic decision ultimately affects real people with real lives. It's about carrying the weight of those decisions with dignity, even when they leave scars. As she concluded her address, the graduating class rose in a standing ovation that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than mere respect for rank or protocol. They were responding to something more fundamental, the recognition of authentic leadership forged in the crucible of failure and resilience. Later that evening, Eliza stood alone on the Pentagon's roof terrace, watching the sunset paint the Washington Monument in hues of gold and amber. The physical pain from her old injuries was present, as it always would be, but it had been transformed from a burden into a reminder, not just of what she had lost, but of what she had gained through that loss. General Marshall joined her at the railing, offering a rare glass of champagne. "To the Strategic Reassessment Office," he said, raising his glass. "6 successful interventions in 3 months. You've already prevented more potential disasters than most strategists manage in a career." Eliza accepted the toast with a small smile. "It's not just me. The team we've assembled, they're doing the real work. I'm just creating the space for them to speak truth without fear." "Don't diminish what you've accomplished," Marshall admonished gently. "You've changed how this institution thinks about strategic dissent. That's a legacy that will outlast both of us." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the last light fade from the sky. The stars began to emerge, pinpoints of clarity in the gathering darkness. "I still carry them with me," Eliza said finally. "The 9 from Northern Light. I still feel responsible." Marshall nodded, understanding without need for elaboration. "You always will. That's what makes you different from most strategists I've known. You never forget that our analyses affect real people with real lives." He studied her profile in the fading light. "But you've transformed that burden into something powerful. The 9 stars on your back aren't just memorials anymore. They're guiding lights for a better approach to strategic thinking." Eliza considered his words, feeling their truth settle into her consciousness.
The phoenix tattoo that had once symbolized only loss and failure now represented something more complex, the possibility of institutional renewal rising from the ashes of past mistakes. The phoenix something more presented only loss ability rising failure, the always carry the weight of lives lost. Something more apresentação de loss more apresentatividade e esse more apresentação de loss more apresentação de loss more apresentação de loss more apresentativa. Lies in more apresentação de loss in more apresentativa failure. But now they also represented the foundation of something better, a strategic approach that valued truth over convenience, analytical integrity over institutional comfort. 7 years in administrative exile had not broken her. Instead, they had forged her into precisely the leader the nation needed, someone who understood from personal experience that strategic decisions were ultimately measured not in geopolitical victories, but in human lives preserved or lost. As night fell completely over Washington, Eliza Monroe, colonel strategist, survivor, looked up at the stars now visible in the clear sky. 9 of those distant lights seemed to shine with particular brightness, not as burdens of guilt but as beacons guiding her forward into a future, where her hard-won wisdom might prevent other stars from being added to the constellation of sacrifice. The phoenix on her back was no longer just a memorial to what had been lost. It had become a promise of what could yet be created from the ashes of failure, a strategic approach that never forgot the human costs behind the analytical abstractions. And in that transformation lay the most powerful lesson of all, that our deepest wounds, when acknowledged and integrated, rather than hidden and denied, can become the source of our greatest wisdom and our most meaningful contributions. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.